Hey, welcome to my channel. I'm going to talk about what's with the tiny house craze anyway. I'm thinking people are losing the sense of philosophy surrounding what the tiny house means in the first place, and this video is going to delve into that. I've had people tell me that they have a tiny house in their backyard, which I think is comical because they just have it in their backyard because they think it's cute and not necessarily because it's something they want to live in. It's like a shed in their backyard, and a shed in somebody's backyard isn't considered a tiny house. Another thing I have a problem with is huge tiny houses. Tiny houses over 400 square feet. Now, it's not that you can't get the benefits out of something that is more than 400 square feet, but I just think that anything that's more than 100 square feet isn't technically considered a tiny house anymore. I would say it's a small house, though. I'm going to talk about the real advantages of living in a tiny house. And if you embrace living in a tiny house, you're going to reap the benefits of living in a tiny house. And that is the whole point around the philosophy of tiny house living. There are many advantages to living in a tiny house, and those benefits are not realized unless you give up the things to fit into the tiny house. We all know that possessing a large house can make you house poor. When you're building a tiny house, you should pay for it as you're building it instead of getting a loan for it. Essentially, you should own it outright when you finish the house. Basically, I did. The only thing that I was paying on was my trailer, and I was done with that in like a year. And I'm proud to say that I own my tiny house outright. If you pay for storage, that cost is a drain. You're better off getting rid of the things so you can dump the payment for the storage. And you probably haven't looked at it in a while anyway. I would say if you haven't looked at it in a year, you might as well get rid of it because you don't need it anymore. Once your tiny house is built, essentially, your expenses become very low. Yes, you will probably have to pay for the land that it sits on. You may have to pay for utilities if you live on the grid. But the cost of those utilities will be a fraction of the cost of living in a large house. And generally, tiny houses are very efficient. One of the things that makes them very efficient is the fact that they're very small. And because your expenses go down, the cost of living goes down. Therefore, you have to earn less money. And therefore, you could work less. So you have more leisure time and more life. You can see how embracing the tiny house lifestyle could benefit you. Any money you spend on rent, storage, or mortgage is something that you basically don't have to pay anymore. And that money could go towards vacations. 2 years after I built my tiny house, I went on a vacation for a month to Thailand. Or you can do whatever you want. But the idea is that you're going to live the lifestyle of your dreams after you build your tiny house. But back to the tiny house craze. The thing is that it's going so out of whack right now that tiny house manufacturers are charging an arm and a leg to build the tiny houses. My house cost $22,000 from start to finish. A tiny house like mine today could cost easily $60,000. I had just heard recently that the median tiny house price now is $119,000. That is an exorbitant amount of money. This goes against the whole entire tiny house philosophy. The whole idea of tiny house philosophy is that you pay for it as you build it. And when you're done building it, you don't owe any more money. And you can live in it very cheaply and therefore gain life back. Fitting a family into a tiny house is a whole different thing. They are not like ordinary houses. And finding alone time, even with 2 people, is difficult sometimes. It gets annoying when only one person fits in your tiny house kitchen, but 2 people are trying to do it. In the beginning, I lived with a partner in my tiny house, and even that was hard. I can't imagine fitting a whole family in one. The core philosophy has completely parted with Jay Schaefer's philosophy of tiny house living. This is sending the wrong message to people. The whole idea is that you can afford a home if you can build it. So what message is this sending about tiny house living? I know one thing, it doesn't align with the tiny house living philosophy. I wonder what percentage of these people that are on the tiny house TV shows end up actually staying in the tiny house. Another thing is, are you trying to fit too much in your tiny house? You gotta have a huge kitchen, a huge refrigerator, a huge bathroom with a full-size tub. I'm not saying you can't fit a good-sized kitchen in a tiny house, but how are you making that decision? And what about a large family? Is the idea that you must have it, and then, geez, I feel like I need a shoehorn in order to fit in the tiny house? Do you have big apprehensions about it and feel like you're giving up too much to fit in the tiny house? You definitely can't be Little Miss Princess living in a tiny house. The essence of the tiny house philosophy must appeal to you. If you're doing it for attention, it will not work. I think people who are down to earth will fit well into a tiny house. and will enjoy it the most. It is just you and the tiny house in the end, without any outside attention. Or are you one of those people that can't wait for their new tiny house life to start? Then this will be a great adventure for you. Really diving into the reason why you are going tiny is a huge investment in your time and money to think about. It's interesting to me that tiny house manufacturers show that you don't have to give up anything to fit into a tiny house, and show that it has everything you need: a washer, a dryer, a huge kitchen, a large bathroom, so much so that these tiny houses are becoming huge structures. If you disagree with me, comment below and tell me why you disagree with me. With the tiny house craze, I feel that the tiny house philosophy is getting lost, along with simple, pure living in a small structure with more peace. Maybe you can't live in a tiny house otherwise. But then my question is, are you really cut out for tiny house living? Tiny house manufacturers are really cashing in on tiny houses now. It's because there is such a high demand for them and people really want them. I can't imagine paying an exorbitant amount to have a tiny house built for you and then deciding you don't like it. And they are making a huge buck manufacturing tiny houses for this tiny house boom. And they are behemoth houses. The tiny house movement has become so popular on TV too. People find themselves moving into a tiny house because it's cute and it's stylish, and then leaving because it's more than they bargained for. Making videos like tiny houses suck, or maybe if one has a partner, living in a tiny house is difficult, and one of them ends up hating it. But people's minds change. Riding the wave of it's cool is not a reason to move into a tiny house. And moving into a tiny house because other people think it's cool is not a good reason to move into a tiny house. Because you'll find yourself in a tiny house after all the fanfare has passed, and if you aren't happy with your decision, you will become acutely aware of it. Generally, I believe that the core philosophy of tiny house living has really departed from Jay Schaefer's original idea. I wonder what he thinks about this craze. And he's still making tiny houses, but he's making them smaller and smaller and less expensive, where the tiny house manufacturing craze is making them huger and more expensive. I think we should get back to the core philosophy of what tiny house living really is. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe and like and comment. Thank you.